Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great event on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of today's event, you will have the opportunity to watch it again later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And we'll take a few minutes near the end of today's webinar and go through those audience questions. And also at the end of today's webinar, we are doing a drawing for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our big winners. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Secrets of Using Quality Metrics to Manage DevOps Release Risk. Our speakers today are Jeff Keyes, who is VP of Product at Plutora, and Marc Hornbeek, who is CEO of Engineering DevOps Consulting and author Engineering DevOps. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining me today. As always.
As always.
Hi.
Glad to be online.
Well, I know you guys have lots to say, and I'm not going to get in your way. So I'm going to put myself on mute, take myself off camera, and I'll see you on the other side.
Awesome. You know, by way of introduction, if you haven't seen and I guess I'll call it a Marc Hornbeek and Plutora webinar before, you're in for a treat. By way, Marc's background is he's varied sets of consulting expertise and helping companies transform into more DevOps-oriented practices. And one of his specialties, I dare call it a superpower, is helping companies through managing continuous quality through this process, as that is one of the Achilles heels as people make that DevOps transformation, is how to understand and accomplish the same level of quality in a different model, and how do you constantly incorporate that. This particular topic is near and dear to my heart, because not only is it a focus of looking at that quality set of metrics, but using those quality metrics that we can create from a release process and a release pipeline as part of the DevOps transformation, as well as part of just releasing better software. We have to do better. And so when we get here, you're going to get a lot of insights and experience into Marc's background with the varied sets of consulting that's here. So Marc, anyways, glad to have you here. Just excited about this topic.
Hey, Jeff, thanks again for having me online and sponsoring this event. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share some wisdom if I have, a lot of history, as you said, and I enjoy trying to share that wisdom and get some feedback from people as well to hopefully update my understanding of things too.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk a bit about what today? Give us kind of a 30-second.
So the main idea is that, like you said, quality is a key part of DevOps. In fact, it's often the underspoken part of DevOps. I always say that, culture is the door to DevOps. You can't get very far without that, but quality is a primary key. And yet quality-driven initiatives often get underfunded because they're misunderstood, and nobody totally wants to pay for quality. So a good way to do that, to mitigate that, is to turn it into something that business folks really understand, which is business risk. So this is all about showing how you can use quality metrics with value streams to manage business risk, and then how that is done will be shown, and then what is needed to actually accomplish the how.
Yeah, and a lot of this is based upon blueprints that we've done in the past. I happen to know somebody who wrote a book about engineering DevOps and what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I'm talking about is in my book, Engineering DevOps, and thank you again for helping to be one of the sponsors of that book. And we have PDF versions and ebook versions available for free on your website, limited numbers, so go get your copy. And we're also producing more extensive paper on this very topic of using quality metrics to manage risk. That'll be available shortly, but the front page is shown, on the slide. So that'll be available on Plutora's website also.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things that as you go down the DevOps journey, you're going to, most people think they've done DevOps once they've implemented CI, and then they go through all the rest of the standard processes that include test and quality management. And there's a problem of trying to shift all these things left. And as you incorporate these things in your pipeline, you have basically quality metrics gathered all over the pipeline. And that really takes us to the blueprint of how these things fit together, that as you look at managing the various pipelines of delivery, there's a lot of different pieces and components to put this stuff together. And the challenge is you've got infrastructure as code, you've got different data elements coming in through the various, plan, CI, and continuous delivery on into operation. And you've got to pull these quality metrics across this entire value stream in order to have a unified view, regardless of your level of automation or how far left those metrics are. So really that takes us to what we're going to get into today. So let's talk about this. Let's just dive in. So what are we going to learn today?
Well, like the slide says, we're going to show you how DevOps in particular, as you introduce DevOps to higher and higher levels of maturity, how it affects what you would want to measure for managing business risks. So that's important. Like you said, there's a lot of dimensions to DevOps, horizontally and vertically across that big picture blueprint.
Yep.
So DevOps, every one of those cross points, if you like, is an opportunity as well as a potential additional business risk that you want to consider when you're putting together a management strategy for business risk and selecting quality metrics. And then we'll talk about some practices for how you can use metrics, and then how you can select them based on a strategy that we'll be talking about. We say recommended. I mean, there really are different approaches, but I have an approach that I recommend for selecting quality metrics and implementing them in a value stream. And we'll have a summary of selection of metrics that have been proven to work for this purpose.
Love it, love it, love it. So, all right, so let's get into the why and really kind of put our finger in some of the problems that we face. Give us, why is this important?
Yeah, so what I said before is the point, right? It's business managers understand business parameters, and they're the ones that are going to invest in it. So having a DevOps digital transformation, needs a business reason, and a business, everything needs to be related to the business. Otherwise, why would they invest?
Right.
So translating quality activities into metrics and then translating that into something that affects business risk is a key way to really get attention and get investment that everybody can relate to, rather than just being at some technical metrics that really maybe not that meaningful to anybody other than the folks in the QA department or something. And understanding the sources of risk is key, and that will vary depending on the individual application, the individual company, and the deployment environment. So that's also important to understand. And finally, understanding how DevOps in particular affects the ability to do this is really critical as well. So all of this is really part of why do we need to understand how to do this, and there's value in doing it, but you need to understand how to do it properly, and folks that have experience are worth listening to, I hope.
Well, what boggles my mind is that in every way, as a company goes through a transformation, someone might listen to the DORA metrics and just say, oh yeah, as soon as we hit DevOps and we do that, magically all of our quality will just automatically improve, because that's what the data points to. But the reality is there's a whole lot of areas where there's quality metrics that need to be brought in so we can look at it from a risk of delivery. And ultimately the job of the entirety of the product team is to bring technology to answer business decisions and manage business risk in any investment that's made. And so as we put these things together, we've got to be able to pull that together. So let's define it then. Let's look at this. Why is using quality metrics to manage risk important?
Right. So the first thing is to identify, what do we mean by risk in this context, at least for this presentation? I call it it's the possibility of suffering business losses from failures from coming out of the DevOps value stream. So those losses can come from multiple places. They can come from failures of the DevOps, value stream, tool chains, and systems themselves, the people, process, and technologies involved. It also can be risk from the software changes that are going through the pipeline in the product. All of those things are sources of risk that offer a possibility of suffering business losses. So what do we mean by business losses? There's kind of like three different sources. If you think of quality as just really trying to understand your customer requirements, so not having proper information so that you don't build the features properly or don't assemble them properly for deployment, that's a quality issue, and that effectively has a primary impact on your product adoption and possibly even your product retention rate and growth, because folks want to have products they like, and that's kind of an end-to-end view of product quality. Lack of controls. If you don't really have the right controls in place, that has the risk of increasing costs. Maybe you have a lot of problems with keeping track of the utilization of the cloud or other sources of cost.
Sure.
And increased cost relates to the bottom line of the ROI, and lack of time just it relates to the the top line of a return on investment. So getting things done quicker will help you get the revenues you hope to get. If you have delays, then it's going to affect the revenue side. So all of these things are key to understanding business risks, and therefore you have to relate the quality metrics to those.
Well, and are there specific types of risks that we should look at more closely than others that that you've seen?
Sure. I mean, the understanding, where the sources of risks are in the pipeline, again, especially relative to a particular application, I wouldn't say there's a generic answer. You really have to, each organization has to have some strategy for identifying risks and preferably codifying the risks so that the information can be used in a fairly quick way as a feature goes through a pipeline. As we all know, DevOps is mostly about agility and trying to get things quickly and faster if possible, at least at the delivery stage, if not deployment. So having a way to codify that so that you don't have to do everything manually is pretty important.
Absolutely. And then bringing that codified risk back to the business is kind of what we're talking about. So, well, let's talk about where the sources of risk are and what they look like. So, what are the sources of risk?
Probably the largest, driver that makes you concerned about risk when it comes to DevOps is, folks, especially that have been used to, slower models like waterfall and so on, is speed, right? DevOps is all about trying to accelerate the speed to delivery, and as you accelerate things, you're introducing, higher possibilities of risk. You use shift left strategies to try to do testing earlier, but when you only have a certain level, a certain amount of time to get through the whole value stream, some things have to shift right, so that you're actually doing some testing in the deployment environment or live environment as well. So all of these things potentially put the squeeze on risk management, and so really understanding the risk of the features that are going through and the risk of the pipelines and elements, and tallying that all up in a fairly dynamic and automated way by codifying it is quite important. So every stage in the pipeline has the possibility for introducing risk. For example, the planning phase, if you don't adequately plan, then there may be risks that you're introducing because you obviously are missing some parts right up front. And you can go through each of the stages and identify specific kinds of risks that can be introduced and therefore ought to be measured. So you want to identify the priorities of each of those. You can't measure everything. It's impossible to measure every possible risk. And it's sort of silly to do every possible metric unless you've got an awful lot of algorithms handling it. So you want to prioritize them and then make sure you measure the ones that are the highest priority according to some codified strategy. Same thing with end-to-end factors, things like mean time to repair, infrastructure elements, and things that are kind of horizontal requirements. And all of these things, there's 3 dimensions, right? There's risk associated with activities of people and the processes and the technology being the technology underlying the pipeline, as well as the technology of the product itself.
Yeah, gotcha. What can you talk about some examples of risk, and what are some examples of risk that you've seen in the planning phase or in the integration phase, and just to kind of jump into that a bit more?
Sure. I mean, there's plenty of examples, but just like I said in planning, if you don't adequately if you're not tracking, let's say, tests associated with a new feature, and making sure that those are being implemented with some kind of entry criteria before you get into integration, then you're adding risk because you haven't tested it adequately before you integrate the feature. So that would be just one example. Let's take an example, the delivery phase. If you don't have artifacts and ways of automating deployment for the subsequent deployment phase, then you're obviously introducing risk because you don't have a way to validate the deployment really worked. So those are just some examples. Later in the slides, we'll talk about a longer list of choices for metrics that are popular.
Absolutely. Well, and so that really, takes us to perspectives of using these quality metrics for risk management, in DevOps-oriented value streams as we get more and more automated. What makes DevOps different? Isn't this just the same old that we've been facing forever? And with waterfall, you're gonna do risk management and quality metrics there. So why is DevOps any different?
Well, DevOps kind of puts the big squeeze on a lot of things, so that's why I think it potentially is different. In some, with DevOps, when it's done properly, simultaneously improves agility, stability, efficiency, quality, security, and satisfaction. Right? That's a big squeeze, right? And so if you don't take into account all of those aspects and goals at the same time, then you could have faster agility but affect quality or maybe security. So you want to, as you have a project, let's say to speed things up, you want to be watching what's going on with security, for example. So that's kind of important with DevOps, maybe more than ever before. As things accelerate, you really got to have metrics in place to keep track of your the heartbeat of all these other things. The other thing is with DevOps, the idea of quality is more cross-functional. So before, maybe quality group had the majority of the responsibility for quality, but with DevOps, the best practice is that you shift quality responsibility heavily more into development, but also it's an end-to-end concept as well. So even some things shift left, so even to the ops team to help monitor quality. So quality management is something that everybody needs to keep track of and take action depending on issues. You can go down the list here, but measuring customer experience, how do you do that when things are changing really quickly if you don't have proper metrics? The idea that in the past, maybe you had different tools and different groups, but to really have consistent metrics, you really want to have some convergence around a tool chain. Hopefully people are using common tools, or at least tools that can produce common metrics if they're not the same tools. In general, DevOps is about restoring service and repairing things rather than just expecting things to work for a long time. So measurements like MTTR are more important than MTBF. In general, the complexity is higher as you get to higher performing DevOps with modular software service-oriented architectures and microservices. Then you've got a network of things to keep track of in the product rather than just a big monolith. And things like in general, just security, making that part of the pipeline and part of everybody's thinking. All of these things are really critical with DevOps more than ever before.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what to those that would say, oh, all we need to do is implement unit tests and just have some set of automated tests in the very beginning and everything will be okay. How do you respond to that from a quality perspective as people go more and more DevOps and they're going to incorporate that in? Is that real? Is that what you're seeing, or do you think there's?
Well, when I talk about continuous quality, I mean, I really emphasize the fact that quality is more than testing. That's I think a misnomer, misunderstanding. When people talk about, oh, quality is about shifting left testing. There are a lot of aspects to measuring quality that are more than testing. So things like monitoring how well you're doing code inspections or code reviews, and how well you're doing planning, and how well you're aligning with your entry criteria. Things like, do I have the scripts for deployment and things of that nature. These are all metrics beyond specifically testing. Testing is definitely included, but a good set of quality metrics for risk management is beyond testing alone.
Yep, absolutely. Well, that kind of takes us to the next thing, which is, okay, so how do we do it? What's the process? How do we actually make this happen? Can you talk a bit about the high level, and then we'll dive into that?
Yeah, so there's really like three things here, even though it looks like four. The strategy, you have to have a strategy, right? How do you decide what is a risk, right? There's no standard. So the idea is, in your organization, have a strategy, and I'll be talking about one strategy that I happen to like. And then you have to know, well, what are the possible metrics? Again, you probably aren't going to do all of them. It's kind of expensive to do all of them, but you have to decide, well, what are the highest priority metrics? And what is the source for choices? So I'll be talking about choices of metrics. And then how do you implement those, right? You need tools and practices that actually implement those metrics. So that's what we're talking about, the how.
Awesome. Well, let's look at the strategy matrix, because everything centers around this, doesn't it?
Right. So having a strategy, I ask a key question when I'm doing assessments: do you have a specific strategy for risk management when you're doing continuous quality assessment? And a lot of folks say, yeah, we have one, but then when you get down to it, they haven't really got it to the point of codifying the risks. So this is just a way I happen to like that helps you actually apply numbers to risks. And there's kind of two dimensions we'll talk about: the risk of features that are being changed, and a risk of tests and quality assessments. And depending on the score, whether they pass or fail, if you like, and what the trends are, then you can assign risk. So in the lower left quadrant, you have low priority risk, things that are not very likely to impact much if they occur, and they're not very likely to happen. So you would assign a low score of things like that. You would literally go through your features and say, well, where do we score this new feature in the backlog? And then every quality check would also have a score. If this thing fails, is it where in this quadrant does it lie? In the upper right, you've got the other end, right? High impact items that are likely to occur often. And again, your actions associated with the different scores tend to vary. If you've got something that's high priority and likely to happen, then you're probably going to go all out and, as much as possible, automate not only measurement and even prevention tactics, but also automate recovery actions as much as possible, because you want to bat them down as soon as they occur, and you're expecting them to occur fairly frequently.
Right.
Whereas the two orange quadrants is sort of in the middle. So the idea is that you really think about your feature changes, each feature, and you also think about the quality checks, and you score them. And if you've got scores, literally codified scores on each of those, then you can start tallying up an overall release score.
And in essence, this kind of gives you a strategy of how to address the risks that are there. I mean, this is a prioritization matrix. So, we're getting some extra audio somewhere in there. Can you give some ideas or some background on the contextual quality metrics and how they play in this?
Well, we have some slides on that, but basically, when you say contextual, I'm not sure what you mean contextual.
Code coverage by risk priority versus counting just a number of tests, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so in general, the better metrics are not just counting metrics. They tend to be things that accumulate in trends as you go through a pipeline. So even things like code static analysis, you typically have some data points. Is the static analysis improving or not as you get closer to a release? If a release is just an individual feature, even still you might have some trends on static analysis. You might be running static analysis in development and then running it again at integration, and maybe again closer to deployment just to validate it's still okay. So trends and things that give you a better perspective of how things are evolving over time tend to have a higher value than just an individual snapshot metric.
Right. So really all this fits into the various aspects, when you're looking at DevOps, where do you look for metrics? And can you talk a bit about that?
So I happen to catalog, I don't know whether anybody else uses this, but I talk about this in my book. I talk about the 9 pillars of DevOps, and I just use this as a model for categorizing things. So vertically, if you like, I break down, I claim every DevOps system worth anything has kind of 9 pillars. So you've got metrics associated with each of those pillars, the pillars being leadership, culture, integration, design, testing, monitoring, security, delivery and deployment. I think I said infrastructure. So each of those pillars has 3 dimensions as well: people, process, and technology aspects. So to me, those are things where you would want to have metrics for each pillar, if possible. In an ideal world, you'd metrify, people, process, and technology for all 3. Again, I don't think of too many people that actually do that, but it's possible. Instead, you try to pick out the ones that are the highest priority for your particular app and your organization, and that's usually going to come out of an assessment.
Yep, and the point here that you're making is basically, hey, look, there's a lot of places that you should be looking at where these metrics are. Especially as I think of new architectures where dependency management in a microservices world is much more in the operations. When things get deployed, you should be looking at how well those things fit together versus just, hey, did we test this individual component? Did it work? This is what made me realize that the way we've been viewing metrics in the value streams has to change. We've got to start looking at all aspects and correlate the various types of metrics together to have a more holistic view of what's going on. Some of those metrics will be gathered automatically, whether they're done in some level of CI automation or smoke test as deployments are made and so forth. But this becomes ever more important, and looking at this and codifying it becomes critical as you start to manage what's going into production. Taking that forward, as you start thinking about end-to-end quality metrics, can you talk about some of these that are interesting to look at from a quality point of view?
Well, this is why I like to use that diagram, because there are some horizontal structures, if you like, in the diagram. They're across the different pillars. There's so many different ways to diagram DevOps, but I happen to like this one. So some things are more relevant in an end-to-end context and certainly need to be tallied up as well, or potentially if they turn out to be the highest priority metrics that you really want to invest in. So things like application release orchestration, keeping track of the whole pipeline of activities, from planning through to operations, the whole value stream, and things like orchestration and automation itself. Overall governance can provide contributions to the metrics. So metrics, for example, time to deploy would be an example of that. The frequency of deployment, success and failures of rates of deployment. So these are just examples. There's also lead time metrics. I mentioned before, mean time to repair is more important than mean time between failure when you're using rapid deployments as a way to keep on track of reliability and availability. So keep track of build times and time to repair. So overall, in addition to the vertical pillars, you want to think about the horizontal structures as well, and that's a total pool of metrics. They are defined in the white paper that's coming out, a complete list of what the potential metrics are, the ones that are most popular that I've seen anyways. And the metric you select should be some combination of the vertical pillars and the horizontal structures in the diagram to be
absolutely. Absolutely. And using these things then to start to focus. So I'm excited about this next part because this is the actual work of codifying. So if we have our priority matrix, let's now talk about creating, in essence, an aspect of scoring releases. And tell us about this model, because this is where it gets really, all that's theory, that's great. Make it real. How do I do something now with what I've got?
So what I show here is an actual example of what I say is the best engineering practice that I have experienced. So at at planning time, or when you're grooming your backlog, for every change, you assign what I'd call a feature risk score, an FRS number, using whatever scoring method you choose. I happen to like the quadrant that I showed earlier. So you would pick for each feature, hey, where does this fit on the quadrant? What number can we give it? 0 to 1 to 10. How risky is it? And then similarly for each stage in the pipeline, as well as end-to-end, metrics, the horizontal metrics I mentioned, whatever ones you select, then also apply, whatever the result is of that assessment. As you go through the pipeline, you accumulate a quality risk score. So at any one point in time, as a feature traverses the value stream, goes through the CI/CD pipeline, you can see where it is relative to the quality score. You can call it a release readiness score, RRS, just by tallying up the set of features times the average quality metrics across the pipeline, and get a release readiness score for a feature. Or if you have multiple features, you can average that and get a release score for the whole release.
Cool. And then based upon this, we could then look at methods for remediation of that risk and or bolstering it to make it better. Well, let's do an example to kind of look and see, kind of diving in to look at the metrics and phases and look at what some of the kinds of things we'd want to look at that we'd want to rate in essence.
Right. So as I said, you probably, there's a long list of possible metrics. You probably don't want to try to attempt to implement the whole list unless you're like a unicorn and have a lot of money. But things like, these are just examples. So at the backlog level, you might choose to keep track of QA tasks, not just testing tasks, but do you have tasks in your backlog for each new feature, especially the high risk ones? And if not, then obviously there's a higher risk than if you do. At the development stage, then is your unit coverage adequate? That would be an example of a risk score. If it's low, then and it's a high risk feature, then obviously the overall risk is going to be higher. During the CI stage integration, to what extent are the smoke tests and tests automated during delivery? To what extent do you have end-to-end coverage against whatever your coverage strategy is? Usually it's something like, for each feature, what was the list of tests that you decided to run or other quality checks? And to what extent is that covered or not by the time you get closer to delivery? When you get to deployment, you might look at things such as, SRE metrics, SLOs, SLAs, and to what extent are, in air budget. When you actually get through deployment, keeping track of the time to repair when there is a problem. So these are just example metrics. End to end, you might look at performance monitoring metrics that they accumulate and staying within your thresholds, and your infrastructure, to what extent is it holding up, delivering what you need reliably, or are there problems there? So all of these things are example metrics that again, you have to go through the list and decide what's most important for your application. But once you have that, and once you have the codified priorities, then you can start using it in a pretty dynamic way through your value stream management platform.
And the essence is that as I assign these risks, I can bring them all together and end up with something that'll help me know where to focus and where to remediate next. And part of the value of a value stream management system is it acts as as a collection point and a system for continuous improvement. Here's a model of how you now can apply quality across your pipelines by using this methodology. So let's look at an example of this, of how you determine this. So do you want to talk about this from an example standpoint?
Yeah, so let's just say, you pushing through some platform change that, has a potential impact on the entire, system. It may be a system of, I don't know, a 3-tier app or something, and there's a foundational component that's changing. So the risk is pretty high, that potentially could, if it fails, it might affect other parts of the system that depend on it. And that could affect the different aspects of business risk, the scheduling, the quality, or the efficiency. And then you keep track of whatever metrics you selected as that feature goes through its stages. And if there are a lot of failures associated with that, you again, for each test or each quality metric, you're assigning a number. And if they fail, then you're going to get an average score. If there's a lot of them fail, you're going to get a higher average risk score. As they are passing, then they lower. But if you average the total set as you get further and further down the pipeline with the feature, then you can get an overall release risk score and see where, you can call it release readiness score is another way to think about it.
Yep.
And typically you'll have some threshold for releasability. In this case, it was, looking at the scores, 54 may be not adequate. It maybe if you set your threshold a score of 50, for example, then this would not be a releasable feature. You'd want to close some more of those tests and quality issues before you make the release.
Absolutely. And all of that is just to do better than, I mean, the point of measuring quality is to manage risk. And now you have something you can actually present back and show the risk across the portfolio of the different applications that you're doing. So, well, let's talk about some of the tools and practices. Walk us through this, how this works. How do I bring all this stuff together? What are the tools, and then how do I do this in practice?
Well, this is where the rubber hits the road, right? It's one thing to talk about it academically; it's another thing to actually implement it. So you really need some kind of what I'd call, what we call a value stream management platform, something that can aggregate all of these metrics as a feature is going through a pipeline or value stream. That's easier said than done, because depending on the metrics, there'll be various sources for the data. It could be from tickets, it could be from trend reports that are through dashboards or logging systems, from test management systems. So you need some way to aggregate all that data. So you need some overall tool that can aggregate it, process it, and report it. But you also need the tools, that can generate the data. Yep. So from a tools point of view, you need a tool chain that is designed to support all of the aggregation of the particular metrics you chose. And then you need practices to go with it, right? If you look at some of the site reliability terminology, for example, you need SLOs to define what you're going to do with the data, make sure that you know how to respond. If you have like I mentioned, a high risk item, you probably would pre-develop, preventative and predictive metrics and take action to avoid having a problem. And when they do, they want some actions to, recover or restore service quickly. You would have practices at every gate. If you like, gates are a good place to tally up the current risk, or at least those tend to be, points where you get a lot more data as you hit an entry gate or an exit gate of a stage. And overall release criteria. So, you're basically boiling down all of those different risk elements into a measurement, so everybody can look at it and glance and say, oh wow, this is where we are, and we have some more work to do or not. Is it a red flag, yellow flag, green flag, overall risk? In general, SRE metrics fit well into this, things like air budgets, but again, keep in mind that SRE is really mostly about reliability. Risk is beyond reliability. It includes reliability potentially, but also other aspects like end-to-end customer satisfaction, and even delivery times and deployments and all of that are business risk. That SRE is good as far as it goes in this regard, but it's necessary but not sufficient, in my opinion, for managing business risk.
That's right. And what I find interesting here is that using this across the pipeline, you have various remediation strategies depending upon the kind of risk that you're facing. Whether you want to increase or improve your recoverability versus prevent anything wrong going into production in the first place. How much do you invest into quality gathering and gating, building quality in versus inspecting quality after the fact? So many different areas to go look as you adopt better DevOps practices, and lots of strategies to deal with each, depending upon the kind of architecture and the kind of application that you're deploying with its related risk. That's why I like this. I think looking at the risk of each pipeline and getting a release risk score is pretty critical. So that that takes us to a question. So what does it take to implement this thing? How do you do it?
Yeah, so I sort of touched on this already, but the general idea is, the key must-have are tools that you can, whether they're homegrown or it doesn't matter what they are, but once you decide what your quality metrics are, you need to implement them. You don't want to have to manually gather this data at the speed of DevOps. So you need tools that can implement, whether they're scripts or commercial tools, to get the metrics from each point in the pipeline, and then you need some way to aggregate all that data into a dashboard and some ways to keep track of, calculate, analyze, and have a way to consume that data so that you can then take action, whether it's preventative action or reaction to events, and try to bat down the risks when they occur and they're out of spec, if you like. Get closer to a release.
Absolutely. Well, and let's kind of break this down and dive into some solution advice, and we're going to talk about a number of things here, but I just want to jump right into, all right, so let's get into a to-do list of how do we take action with our current pipelines. Give us some feedback here and just take us through this. What do we got to do?
Well, one thing I see too many people doing is taking shortcuts with this. They say, oh, we'll ask the QA architect or something to define all of it. No, you really want everybody to buy into it. It's kind of like the same thing with DevOps. You want to have alignment. Otherwise, it's just data that people don't accept. And the neat thing is that every functional group has an opportunity to inject a component of the algorithm for the release metric, for the risk metrics, so that it gives them a way to codify their inputs and have them taken care of feature by feature, release by release. So leadership sponsoring is a key thing to do, and really defining priorities in a way to assign priorities, making sure the metrics have actions, not just data, but look at the different pillars and the horizontal structures and make sure that whatever you select have specific actions attached, whether they're it can be proactive and reactive actions. And let's say if they're high priority, then you probably want both. Selecting a tool to aggregate all the data and do the analysis and provide actionable interface. Making sure all the tools that feed into it are there. Make sure that you got the highest priority metrics. A good way to test it is to actually start with a model application or a lighthouse application and try out these things before you implement them across the board. And then finally, operationalize, measure, do an adoption of those metrics across a broader range of applications, and then iterate. So along the lines of continuous improvement level 3 of, or what's called the mature DevOps, where you do continuous improvement through experimentation and adoption.
Right, and then you can take whatever you operationalize, reinforce it with leadership, and kind of walk back through this all again. So what do we not want to do? How do we know we're messing this up?
Well, again, unless you're a unicorn that has like almost an infinite amount of money, you probably don't want to choose all the metrics, because that's nonsense. You're not going to be able to afford to do it, monitor it, even if you had them all. So, be careful about which metrics you select. There's a list in the paper. I'm not going to go through them here in this shorter webinar, but make sure that you select the ones that are the highest importance to you. Otherwise, you just got a lot of noise, and you might as well not have the metrics. Just more problems. Don't invest in specific tools until you know what your strategies are. A lot of people get married to a particular tool, and they find out they're not the right ones for doing this. Making sure the metrics can be, have priorities assigned. If not, then what's the point? You're not going to be able to really do anything with them. It's just data that again adds noise. Make sure you've got actions. If you have metrics without actions assigned, they're like, why?
Right, exactly.
Very much. Don't assume the same metrics are good for every app, even though you might have a model app as a lighthouse. There can be the variances. Maybe an app has, some apps have a lot of high priority concerns in one layer of the system that don't apply in another app. And generally, keep pruning the apps and changing them as you need to as the system evolves. Don't just assume that there's a static set of metrics over time.
Right. Well, because once you solve and really mitigate risk, the risk profile changes, and then now you've got to focus on another area to actually do that. So yeah. I know, you've been to a lot of customers. You've kind of walked through this a lot of times before. I thought it was really fun to take some time and walk through what happened at one of the companies you were consulting with, and some of the things you did to mitigate those risks and looking at the metrics.
Yeah, so this was an interesting one. It was a government agency, and they, the front end of the process was a commercial off-the-shelf system. So they didn't really have a lot of visibility into the, if you like, the front end of the value stream, because the supplier did that, and they really had a lot of visibility on the back end, but they didn't really have any metrics for that either. And they wanted to reduce their lead time from basically the time when the COTS vendor said that we've got something coming until there was a release, from an average of 9 weeks to 2 weeks. So there was a pretty drastic, shortening they were wanting. And, there's a lot of risk. There were already risks in the 9 weeks because they didn't have enough metrics in place. But going to 2 weeks, it was recognized right up front that, keeping track of risk is critical. Or, you're possibly introducing too much risk along with shortening the cycle. So there were 3 types of risks that were deemed high priority. From the quality point of view, end-to-end testing was deemed to be a good risk, keeping track of the coverage of that. The delay element, if do we really get the value of shortened releases? If not, then that's not going to help, if you like, the business of this app. So keeping track of horizontal metrics of deployment and timing for agility. And then finally, user experience, customer complaints, and in general, the time to repair was deemed to be an important measure of that. If customers don't like to see things down very much, so keeping track of the time to repair and trends were important. So those are 3 examples of metrics that were used in this actual customer use case.
What did you find as you focused on those? What were some of the outcomes that you realized?
Well, in general, right? I mean, everybody gets energized when they see some actual metrics that they didn't have before.
Right.
This perspective. So for the most part, it kind of gave a perspective they didn't have. So it gave a sense of purpose that they didn't have before for the implementation team in both Dev and Ops and QA in this case. Customers, fundamentally they didn't see these metrics, but they end up getting the results of having the metrics. So there hasn't been enough field experience for this particular example to say a whole lot about customers' reaction, but my understanding is it's improved.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, very cool. All this takes you to why, this is an approach of how to manage risk of your delivery, and it involves a whole lot of data gathering. And so why is Plutora here? Because Plutora is this value stream management platform. What's the relationship? And The point is this is a really interesting use case of using value stream management platforms to not only look at the flow efficiency of your delivery pipelines, but also use it for managing the risk of delivery, which is critically important. Plutora is one of the strong performers, one of the lead vendors in the value stream management space, and well recognized. We've got very large customers. If you're not looking into value stream management now, please do. It is the space that will help take you forward in the future. The point is, there's a lot of data that you need to gather across your pipelines and pull that data together. The way we see this data is paramount for application delivery. So what Plutora does is we sit as a cloud-based platform to ingest data from across the tool chain, independent of whatever the tooling that's used or the level of DevOps maturity. We don't care. Bring it together and correlate it into standardized pipelines where we can then help orchestrate releases. We can manage the environments, and manage all the deployment activities, and then provide analytics and insights for that delivery to help you manage risk. So what makes that cool then is then one of the parts of data that we pull in is quality data, and realizing that quality data is tracked in a lot of different stages, just like we talked about, primarily in unit test as well as in UAT and some of the environments that are lower environments. We now correlate that together in a pipeline itself and have the capability of creating this kind of release risk score. We already show you a 360-degree view of your releases themselves by showing you the number of defects and sort of a release readiness, and can pull in other data to customize this depending upon how you want to manage that risk itself. So as you pull in more of the code coverage, the build and build readiness, and you can now start to evaluate more of an overall holistic view of your releases, looking at the release risk rating, and you can use a model just like this in your environment. We're so excited about that we're putting together a white paper that I know Marc talked about. We talked about at the beginning. It should be available next week, and it will include the details of some of the metrics and so forth, and how you can use the platform to get there. And I don't want to be insensitive about current things that are ongoing with the nature of the world today, as it has been a little scary, but we want to help you wherever you are. We recognize that teams are working remotely, and you still have to solve the same problems. And as such, we're offering a special promotion where we can help connect your software delivery factory even remotely, and especially remotely, and we help make this work that used to be done face to face. You can connect it all together regardless of where people sit. We can bring the culture and activities together, people, and manage the activities together. So the whole point of this is that you don't have to be stuck with whatever tooling you have now. We can use that tooling, bring the data in, and manage the risk of delivery using a single platform, and then you can create the right analytics and reporting to demonstrate to leadership where your risk is, and then you can work to improve it and then demonstrate that you did better than you did before. I mean, ultimately, isn't that the question that matters? Are we getting better? And how few of us can actually answer that question. So with that, I think we got about 6 minutes for questions. Let me dive through some of the questions here. Marc, there's a question of do you recommend a stage gate program to implement in this process? What's your thoughts on that? And I have some comments on that too.
Well, I recommend that stages are defined, at least for any one application, and that you have an entry criteria and an exit criteria, and that there be metrics for keep track of to what extent are you meeting your metrics for entry and exit. So in that sense, yes, of course, that's how those are the good points to tally up results and display it in your dashboard or take action from there.
Yeah, I'm with you on this. I know I've heard other proponents saying stage gate is legacy, you don't need it, and presumably if you've got a a very, very small mean time to recovery so that your risk of failure is not that bad, then sure. But the challenge is you're looking at customer trust. It's not necessarily whether or not you blew up production. How do you verify that you actually did the right thing for the customer? How do you verify that the functionality actually works with the rest of the application well, not just did it bring down production so you have to roll it back? And there's strategies on dealing with that, but frankly, in order to incorporate all those different kinds of metrics, I'm a big believer and fan of stage gate kind of methodology. There's nothing to say that those gates and criteria have to be heavy, but to have a standardized model of stage gate that you can apply to any pipeline is awesome. And then if there's a pipeline that is doing really, really well, you can lower down their criteria or automate the criteria checking so that it just flows right through, and that's and no big deal as necessary. There's another question asking about release risk and what about the voice of the customer?
Sure. So the customer feedback can come in the form of different metrics at the operations stage, typically, is where the customer is going to actually get experience with the feature. They may also have feedback on, the delivery process as well. So, you can have metrics where you're judging the customer's acceptance rate, to what extent are customers adopting a change. When you do dark launches, for example, to what extent are we getting good customer scores in let's say an A/B comparison. They may not actually send in a number, but you can judge the uptake rate of A versus B as an example, when people are just using a new change. So that's one way of doing it. You may in fact incorporate some survey data, but typically that's not fast enough for the type of things that we're discussing. It typically is more like measurements of customer usage and problems that might be occurring and that are being reported by customers as a way to feed into the overall releasability. So sometimes the releasability score for a feature may be altered in the future based on past performance. So that's a way to incorporate customer feedback as well. It may be too late for a feature that already was released, but you can still incorporate what you learned by adjusting this, let's say the feature risk score for a feature in the future based on customer feedback.
Awesome. I'll paraphrase this question. There's a bunch of different tools that orchestrate and do all sorts of things. Is there a tool that collects data from the different data sources and correlates them together? Yes, that's what we do. Precisely, that's what we do. We aggregate data across the pipeline. We correlate these into releases that are from planning to production. We include a whole lot of stuff from scoping data to the phases and gates of delivery. And then we correlate also test metrics, build metrics, the scope and so forth, all together, giving you a timeline kind of view of all the activities that go along. Ultimately with the intention of giving you an overall release risk. And utilizing these quality metrics is another aspect to help codify the release risk itself. And that's why this is interesting. That's why we're doing this webinar. We got about a minute. I know there's a bunch of questions saying, where's the link to the book? I want to just jump back a bunch of slides because we showed that link early on. There we go. If you want to get the book, it's awesome, and we'll have a white paper coming soon enough. But with that, I'll turn the time back to you, Charlene, and for any final little bits.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'm not going to go back on camera because I don't want to crash the system, because I know we've been having technical difficulties. So with that, at the top of the hour, I did mention that we would be doing a drawing for 2 Amazon gift cards. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and do the drawing here. Our first winner today is, let's see, Keith K. Congratulations, Keith. And our next winner today is Nancy G. Congratulations, Nancy. We're going to be following up with both of you offline to get your Amazon gift card over to you, so please check your email for that. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. We will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website, so you can always find it there. Just go to devops.com/webinar, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Jeff and Mark, thanks so much for a great presentation. As always, looking forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, all right, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, if you need help in any of these areas, don't hesitate to reach out. Don't do this alone. Drop me or Mark a message, and this is what Mark does, is helping companies transform.
Awesome.
And we're a software solution helps this process, so that's why we're here.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. All right. Also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing out. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.